May Allah send blessings upon our leader Muhammad, the opener of what was closed, the seal of what came before, the helper of the truth through the truth, and the guide to his straight path, along with his family in accord with his immense measure and rank. It is my honor to introduce to you my friend, my teacher, my brother, Dr. Rasul Miller. Mashallah, he recently graduated with his PhD in Africana Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. And he and his wife are here. His wife, Sister Samiha, is upstairs with their children. They're getting the children situated. Inshallah, you'll get to hear from her later. She's also in the final leg of her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania as well. And his wife is from Bangladesh. Anyone from Bangladesh? Oh, Allahu Akbar. All right. Bengalis in the house. Alhamdulillah. Achambalo. Allahu Akbar. So, mashallah. So his wife is from Bangladesh, and inshallah, you'll get to meet her later on. Thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful turnout. And again, thank you for bringing your children. We hope to have parallel children programs sooner than later. And I'm just going to read Dr. Miller's bio, and then he will proceed. Dr. Rasul Miller is a historian of Black Muslim communities in the Atlantic world. He received his PhD in history and Africana studies from the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests include Muslim movements in 20th century America and their relationship to Black internationalism and West African intellectual history. He currently serves as a postdoctoral associate in the study of the racialization of Islam at Yale University's Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. Indigeneity and transnational migration. He's also traveled extensively around the world. Most recently, he and his family spent a year or more, a year in Senegal with traditional scholars. So he's not only academically trained, he's also had the blessing of sitting at the feet of some of the most preeminent scholars of the Muslim world. Among them, Sheikh Mahi Sise, Sheikh Ali Tijani Sise as well. And so we're very happy to have him. And I want to just, before we begin, I just want to just recognize a few people. We have some of our board members here. I saw Dr. Zak Mania. Please stand up. Zia Rahman. Are there any other board members here? So thank you. We thank you for your graciousness. We also want to recognize Imam Qarib Bashir, who I see. Please stand up. This is one of our pioneer imams at the Islamic Center viewing. We have Sheikh Hasib Abdurrahman from Zubaydah Foundation. We have Imam Muhsin from Masjid al-Safat. And are there anyone I haven't recognized?
And everybody else.
Okay, tayyib. And and all of you, mashallah, may Allah reward you. And thank you for taking time out tonight. Without any further ado, Dr. Rasul Miller.
Assalamu alaikum. This is the best mic to use. Okay. This is good. Assalamu alaikum. Can everyone hear me? Can anyone not hear me? Raise your hand if you haven't. Okay. Too far. Is this better? Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum. Everybody can hear me? Yeah? Anybody can't hear me?
Speak a little loud.
Okay. I'm trying to. Oh, mashallah. I'm going to speak loud, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم.
Or you can hold this.
This is good. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراط المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدر المقدار العظيم. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم إني أسألك من كل خير سألك منه محمد نبيك صلى الله عليه وسلم، وأعوذ بك من كل شر استعاذك منه محمد نبيك صلى الله عليه وسلم. اللهم اغفر لنا ما قدمنا وما أخرنا وما أسررنا وما أعلنا وما أنت أعلم بما منا. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من فتنة المحيا والممات ومن فتنة القبر ومن فتنة الدجال ومن عذاب النار وسوء المصير. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد رضي الله عن أصحاب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. يا همة الشيخ احضرنا بهذا المحضر ولتعطفي بنظرة تأتي لنا بظفر. أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. How's everybody doing? Alhamdulillah. Making dua that Allah calm me down and guide my tongue, inshallah ta'ala. So first off, welcome. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm excited. This is my, I think, just second time at the masjid. I was here for an aqiqah, some good friends of mine who are part of the community here. And excited to be with you all. I was excited when I got the invitation from Imam Mendes. I said, man, of course, like, you could just call me to just hang out. You don't even have to ask me to give a talk or nothing. But alhamdulillah, I'm appreciating his estimation of me, feeling that I have something to offer. So I hope and pray, inshallah ta'ala, that what I share with you today is beneficial. I'm going to try not to talk too long because I do want to leave some time for questions and answers and comments, inshallah ta'ala. And I always like to start off my talks in a setting like this when I have, some of my esteemed elders in the room, that if you hear me say something and you feel like it ain't right, don't feel like you can't check me. I come from the school that, all of you, this is the village. Y'all are all my aunties and uncles, and I would rather you pull my coat than somebody who doesn't love me pull my coat. They're not going to pull my coat. They're going to try to, do something else. So alhamdulillah. So inshallah, we'll go ahead and begin. So as you see here, the title that I put up here for the talk is different than the title you saw in the flyer. I'm saying Islam. Oh man, my computer keeps going black. That might be a problem. SubhanAllah. Okay, now I gotta go back. So the title, we'll go all the way back to the beginning. You see it says Islam, Race, and the Making of the Atlantic World. So we put on the flyer, I think, something like the history of Islam in America and the Americas, because we were worried that people wouldn't know what we were talking about when we say the Atlantic world, right? So the Atlantic world is a term that historians and scholars sometimes use for the geographical area around the Atlantic Ocean, right? And you see what places are around the Atlantic Ocean. You see you have Europe, you see you have Africa, you see you have South America, you see you have North America, right? And this is also the area that was involved in the transatlantic slave trade, right? So the reason why I start this way is because if you're going to understand anything about the history of Islam in this part of the world, you have to understand it in the context of this broader Atlantic world, right? Because the first Muslims who come to this part of the world, right, we believe, well, we essentially know that most of them, they come from the African continent. And there's a whole political economic dynamic that brings them to this part of the world. And so we have to start the history by sort of understanding those dynamics, right? And this is what we mean by the Atlantic world. And when we look at the sort of the history of Muslims in the Americas, there are different accounts of individuals or explorers potentially coming to the Americas, right? There's a 12th century Chinese account of Muslims, probably Arab explorers, reaching a region called Mulan Pi, that people have speculated maybe this is America, right? There are oral accounts. Actually, there's written accounts of a man named Abu Bakr, or sometimes he's referred to as Abu Bakr II. He was a ruler of the West African, I don't like to use the word empire, but the West African nation or polity of Mali, right? You may have heard of his younger brother, Mansa Musa, right? So the narrative goes that his older brother went west to see. He had a notion that if you went west, it wasn't just water. There was something on the other side of that water. And so the West African historical accounts say he went west and he took a fleet and he was never seen again. So there's speculation that he might have reached the Americas, because there's some evidence of an Islamic presence in the Americas going back that far, right? But all of this is somewhat inconclusive. We don't really know, right? But it's possible. It is possible. But the first significant communities, and when I say significant, I mean numerically significant communities of Muslims that we know of, they come to America via the transatlantic slave trade. These are enslaved Africans, right, from West and Central Africa that are brought to America, right? And now the scholars are saying maybe something like 1/3 of them are Muslim. First, they used to say 10 to 15%. Now they're saying 1/3, right? Part of that is because the assumption, when you look at what they call demography, when you try to count people, the assumption is they're not unless we have evidence that they are. So people start with the evidence that all these people from Africa must have been something other than Muslim. And as we get more and more evidence indicating that no, more and more of them were Muslim, those numbers are starting to expand, right? So it's not like we're saying 1/3 of them were Muslim and we know the other 2/3 was something else. We don't know what they were, right? So we may find out one day that maybe 50% of them were Muslim. No, we don't know. But we know that roughly 1/3, scholars are estimating now, of them were Muslim, right? So in the first half of my presentation, I'm going to focus on this early Atlantic world context to sort of set the stage. And then hopefully in the second half of my presentation, I'm going to talk about more contemporary things, right? But I think this part of the history, I think, is very important, and it's under discussed, right? So I'm going to jump into it, inshallah ta'ala. First, I think I want to ask a couple of questions, right? Just to get some interaction with the audience, so you're not just hearing my voice, inshallah ta'ala. So we're going to start back around the end of the 13th century, right? Talking about these processes that lead up to this resettlement, relocation of all of these Muslims from the Atlantic, from one side of the Atlantic to the other, right? So we could start in 1500, we could start in the 13th century. We're going to start in the 13th century. So in the 13th century, if you had to guess, looking at this geographical area, who would you think are the major players, the major world powers, right, at this time in the Atlantic world? Europe, someone said. The Spanish, right? The Spanish. Okay, which Spanish? Spain, yeah, okay, yeah. So we're going to talk about like Granada, so like the Muslims, okay, who Spain who came initially from North Africa, some from West Africa, yeah. Spain, Europe, right? Okay. My second question is, where are my questions? Well, if you had to guess, because slavery exists all throughout the world at this time. There's really we don't really know of any region that didn't have any slavery at this time. Pretty much all over the world, you had some form of slavery. Who do you think if you had to guess, who do you think were the main people who were enslaved in the world at this time? Where do you think they were from? Africa, right? Okay, Africa. I had another question, but I don't see it. But we'll go with just these two questions, and I think we'll prove the point. So, if you look at this region during this time, someone said Spain was a major player. That's absolutely right. Britain was not. France was not. Germany, or what we call it this time, Prussia, was not. Spain definitely was. Another place that was the empire or kingdom, if you want to call it that, of Mali, which we just mentioned, right? Oh, the richest man in the world at this time, into the 13th century. Where do you think he was from? Mali, Africa. I gave you that one, right? That's Mansa Musa, right? So, but you'll get my trend, right? So Mansa Musa is the richest man in the world, right? West African man, Muslim, right? The big world players are Muslim-ruled Spain, right? Ruled by folks who actually come from North and West Africa, right? West Africa too. Even when you look at the European records of the way they describe Moors, they have these different languages to identify different types of Moors. You have the Black Moor and the Tawny Moor, indicating that some of the folks who were identified as Moors were people who were clearly from sub-Saharan West African, ancestry. What was my other question? Oh, slavery. Anybody know where the word slave comes from? Huh? Yugoslavia. Well, not Yugoslavia per se, but Slav, right? Slav. Eastern European peoples. The reason is because many of the people who were enslaved at this time came from that region in Eastern Europe, right? You even might be surprised to know that there are records from this period in the chronicles of Ibn Battuta and Ibn Khaldun. You've heard of these famous Muslim explorers, right? There are records indicating that you could find white Turkish slaves. They say Turkish. We don't know if they were Turkish, but white Turkish slaves in West Africa at this time. So the world looks totally different than what we might guess from looking at the way the world looks today. So what happened? Right? What happened? When I was preparing this lecture and I thought about a way to frame it, and I thought that it's important for us to know what causes this change in sort of the global order, I was reminded of the hadith where the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us that there would come a time. He told the Sahabas there would come a time where the Muslims would be beset by their enemies all around. And the Sahabas asked, "Will you a number?" And he said, "No, you'll be as many as the foam of the sea, as numerous as the foam of the sea. But Allah will remove the fear of you from the heart of your enemies and will put weakness in your heart." Right? So what did that look like? How did this happen? Right? How did this process of the world sort of being turned upside down from what it looked like in this earlier period happen? What happened? So I'm hoping that, well, the argument that I want to make to you is that the reason why certain nations, certain groups sort of were victorious and came out on top, it may be different than what you might have thought prior to today. Maybe, right? I remember I had a beautiful, beautiful Quran teacher, an amazing, wonderful, beautiful man. And he used to ask me, he used to call me Hanif. My middle name, he said, "Hanif, how did America get to success?" Right? He would ask me this question. And, I might say, "Well, I don't know, Sheikh, how? You tell me." So, because they have a system, right? And he was my teacher. So I just said, okay, alhamdulillah. But what I learned from studying history is that it had to do with things like colonization, had to do with things like slavery. And so when we learn this history, one of the things that it will hopefully undo, inshallah, many of us as Muslim people in this part of the world, or all over the world, we have a sort of sense of inferiority. Y'all know what I'm talking about? We have a sense of sort of inferiority when we think about back home, right? If we basically we say, oh, back home, they do stuff backward. If we're West African back home, they're corrupt. If you, like me, African American back in the South or back in the inner city, we're backward. And that's why we don't have anything, right? Because of we're not doing this, we're not doing that, right? But what does our tradition teach us about people's rank in society? Does it teach us that if you have money, it's because you worked hard? And that if you're poor, it's because you have some kind of moral failing, right? When the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had a period in his life where him and his companions were eating leaves, right? When our mother Sayyidina Khadija, some people have speculated that she may have even died due to starvation because there wasn't enough food. Just today, I was at Yale with Imam Bajwa, and he was telling us about the history of the Sahaba Mus'ab, radiallahu anhu, and how he was someone who was from a very affluent family, and he gave everything up to be Muslim, right? He gave up all of his privilege, and it got so bad that this man who was known to have the best clothing and the elders of the society would sit this young man next to him because he was just so what we would say fly, right? But so dapper, right? It got so bad that all he had was one garment that looked like the equivalent of like a ragged potato sack, right? And when he was martyred, and Imam Omar told us the beautiful story, had us in tears of the way he was martyred, right? When he was martyred at the Battle of Uhud, right? After he was martyred, the Muslims were trying to figure out how to cover his body. They said he has so little cloth that if we cover his head and the top of his body properly, his bottom is exposed. And if we cover the bottom, his top is exposed. What do we do? And the Prophet ﷺ said, well, take the cloth and cover his head and the top of his body, and we'll use some leaves to cover the body. Because when a person is martyred in battle in our tradition, you leave them. You don't wash them and whatnot the way you normally do when a Muslim passes away, right? So the Prophet ﷺ said, do that, and then I'm going to bury him myself, right? So this is the kind of earthly dunya poverty that many of the heroes of our tradition, the best of mankind, right, suffered. But when we see people who are poor, we associate that with, well, they must be doing something wrong. And when we see people who have wealth, sometimes we associate that with them doing something right. And it's not necessarily the case. So this is what I'm going to try to explain, right? So sort of the dynamics of how we got to where we are, inshallah. Imam Mendes, he asked me to share some books with you all, and I got a couple hard copies, but I wanted to put some books that I couldn't get physically up on the screen that I wanted to sort of introduce you to as I walk you through some of these historical developments, right? This is a really good book by a man named Frank Snowden, a scholar who I believe he taught at Harvard, African-American scholar. Did he teach at Harvard? I have to look that up. I know his son taught at Yale, but he wrote this book called Before Color Prejudice. He's actually, I'm sorry, he taught at Howard, but I think he might have gotten his PhD from Harvard. In any case, I may be mistaken. But he's a celebrated scholar, right, of African history. And this book, Before Color Prejudice, The Ancient View of Blacks, one of the things that he lays out, he helps to demonstrate the fact that the sort of racial hierarchy and color bias that we have today, he demonstrates how it didn't exist in sort of the old world, right? So he looks at the ancient world, he looks at the ancient Greeks and Romans and what they had to say about people of African descent from places like Egypt, places like what is today Ethiopia, right? And he demonstrates that this kind of color prejudice that we have today, that we see today, it wasn't a factor in the old world. And many historians, not everyone would agree, but many historians would agree that even the idea of race is a very minor construct that develops in this same moment in time when we have the emergence of the transatlantic slave trade, the opening of the Atlantic world. So before that, it doesn't make sense to talk about things in the form of race. Even when you read from our history of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when you see people using words like white and black and red and brown, doesn't mean what we mean today, right? Like when the Prophet ﷺ said, I come for the browns and the reds, right? Well, who are these red people that he's talking about, right? And when you see in certain hadith, when he talks about people being white, right? But when you look at the people he's talking about, they're not people from Europe. So who are these white people he's talking about? It's because these colors, people using terms like green to describe people, they don't correlate with our modern notions of race. And when you look at how people understood human difference, it wasn't in a language of race. It was in a language of ethnicity. Where are you from, right? Where are you from? What's your family lineage? What language do you speak? What is your culture? Things like this. So this is a good book for people who want to take notes of sort of starting places to begin to research some of these different little sort of chunks of what I'm talking about. This is a good book to start to look at that. This is another book by a woman named Linda Colley, who's a historian of British history. And this book is called Captives. And you can look at the kind of provocative cover and you see a person with brown skin who's grabbing the arm of a person with white skin. So this book discusses the phenomenon of white people from Britain being enslaved, in particular by North African people, right? People off the coast of North Africa would have ships. And again, as we said, slavery was common. And many of these people in North Africa who were seafaring people were people who either themselves or their ancestors were kicked out of Spain after the Europeans retook Spain, and there was a mass sort of exile, right? Either you had to leave or you were forced to leave, right, from Spain if you were a Muslim person, or you had to change your religion, right? So you have this phenomenon of seafaring people who were actually enslaving white people, right? Interesting book for a couple of reasons. One, because it talks about the nature of British colonialism, which is a part of the story that we're going to tell today a little bit, is connected to that story. You may be familiar with that part of the story, right? Desi folk in the room, if you're from, Indian Ocean world. So if you're from, India, Bangladesh, or Pakistan, or if you're from the Arab world, right, you might know you know that side of the story. So today we're connecting that with a connected phenomenon that was happening on the other side of the world, right, around the Atlantic Ocean world. They're really two sides of the same story, right? But the other thing that's interesting about this book is you notice the years are from 1600 to 1850. From 1600 to 1850. That period of time is important because it's during that period of time that slavery becomes racialized, that the racial hierarchy we have today emerges, right? It's during this period, right? So it's really not even until the 18th century, even going into the early 19th century, that this idea that certain people are people that can be enslaved and certain people are not, right, comes to pass. Right. And at this point, you have particularly the British, but other European nations as well, who have enough power that they can impose this law globally. Like it's okay for you to enslave people from certain parts of the world, but it's not okay for you to enslave people from another part of the world. Right. So this book talks a little bit about this history. And this book, and this is probably the last book I'm going to show on the screen today, but this book is an excellent book that I encourage everybody to take a look at. It's called Black Marxism: The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. Now, well, Imam Mendes is cool. I was going to say, Sheikh, don't throw me out the masjid. But the book, the title is misleading, right? It's not a book about Marxism, right? It's not a book promoting Marxism. It's actually a book. The title is very misleading. The scholar Robin Kelly, he writes the foreword to this book, and he says the book is so much more ambitious than the title. Like, I don't know why he picked that for the title. But really, it's a book that traces the emergence of the Western European economic system, right? And traces the emergence of the response, the critique to that, which is people refer to as Marxism, and problematizes both, right? He problematizes both. He says they're both a product of the same Western world context. And so they're both sort of fraught with all of these assumptions about race and about power and about class. And he says essentially that there's another tradition of resistance or of critiquing of this world system that we can chart to the African continent. And that's what he calls the Black Radical tradition. And I don't know if I have my bag with me, but yeah, I do. A friend of ours, a good friend of ours and a brilliant scholar by the name of Bilal Ware, right? Oh, I don't have the book with me, mashallah. Wrote an excellent book called The Walking Quran. And when I teach a class at Yale, and I teach this book, sections of this book along with that book, because Cedric Robinson gives this beautiful, detailed history of Europe. And he says there's this, and he talks about the history of Moorish Spain and Muslims in the Atlantic world, but he's left kind of searching for the roots of this Black radical tradition, right? And the answer to that is in Brother Bilal Ware's book, right? It's the Muslim response to the ways in which the world was changed in this moment. You begin to find all of these West African Muslim, they call them jihad movements. People like Sheikh Uthman Al-Fodio, Al-Hajj Umar Tal, radiallahu anhu. Before that, a man named Sheikh Nasruddin in what is today Mauritania, who leads really the first militant revolt, because the Muslim scholars in West Africa, they're peaceful. They say we don't engage in violent conflict, right? We just build schools and we help people, and that's how we win the hearts of the people, by serving the people, bringing benefit to the people. But something happens when the world gets turned upside down by this emergent system, this emergent economic system that leads to the rise of the West, and the Muslims begin to take up arms because it has local reverberations where everyday people, Muslim women and men, are being enslaved, right, and being oppressed. And they say, we've been peaceful, but now this is justification for us to defend our communities, right? The Shia are saying, what kind of sheikh am I if I can't defend my people, right, from being carted away, taken to slavery, and being killed and being subjected to this kind of oppression, right? But I wanted to point out to a couple of important sort of aspects of not so much this book, but this book does kind of, it's a good place to go if you want to investigate more about this history. But a couple of important things happen in this moment. We're talking about roughly 1500, right? Beginning of the 16th century, right? What happens around that time? Why did I pick this moment? Huh? Say again? Right. No, the European Renaissance is even a little before that. What happens? Inquisition, 1492, right? This is this dawn of this Atlantic world. Oh, man. MashaAllah. Alhamdulillah. You got to make dua. We have better connection. Alhamdulillah. So there's a couple of things that you need to know about Western Europe. And because we have limited time, this isn't a class like that. So I have to kind of just lay it out, right? So one of the important arguments he makes in this book, he talks about the fact that in Western Europe, you had slavery in Western Europe, right? In Britain and Prussia and France, you had slavery, right? You had people that we would conceive of as white enslaving other people that we would conceive of as white. And so what develops is a kind of caste system, right? Where certain ethnic groups are like Slavs. Certain ethnic groups are expected to be slaves. Certain ethnic groups are imported to do different kinds of labor, kind of like we have in our society now, right? Certain kind of work, people are saying that ain't for me to do. Yeah, question? No. People say that's not for me to do. We're gonna have to import somebody to do that. Certain people are imported to be military, to be soldiers, right? And so you have this kind of caste system of stratification based on ethnicity that Cedric Robinson, the author of this book, he basically argues, I think very convincingly, this is kind of the roots of our modern racial hierarchy, right? And if you know anything about the history of North America in the 20th century, you know that as certain white ethnic groups come to America, they're at first sort of racialized differently, right? Like when the Irish first come, right? They're really put on a lower sort of racial rung, right? And there's a whole sort of history to how these different white ethnic groups that are seen by other white ethnic groups as being lesser, right? How they sort of get inducted into whiteness. And part of it is that they sort of commit acts of violence against Black communities. There's a whole nother history, right? But that's part of sort of what you got to do to get let into that club of whiteness, right? So this is really how this concept of whiteness sort of emerges, right? Another important interconnected part of that is the rise of nationalism, right? Nationalism. Sometimes when I teach this to my students, I pause for a moment and I ask them, can you imagine a world without nation states? Right? Can you imagine a world without nation states, without governments? Can you? Well, some people, yeah, I know you can, but can you imagine a world where there's no nations, right? It's hard because we're products of our reality. We've never known a world without nations. But if you lived in the year 1500 or 1400 or 1300, you lived in a world without modern nation states, right? Where a government has a monopoly on things like force, right? Like, no, you can't, do certain, in America is a little different, but most places you can't use a gun to protect your home, right? But the state can, right? And if the state wants to take your home by gun, nothing you can do about it. This is a more recent phenomenon. This comes in around this 1600s era. And with it, the notion that there are some people who have a right to sovereignty and some people who should be governed by somebody else, right? And these nation states collaborate with an emerging class of a transnational community of people with wealth, right? People follow what I'm saying? It's a transnational community of people with wealth. The wealthy Italian merchants and the wealthy French merchants and the wealthy English merchants, they get together and they build relationships with these governments and they say, okay, you can't go and invade your neighbor nation, France, but you can go and invade India and say, this is mine, right? Or you can go and invade Senegal and say, this is mine. And the resources there are for you, right? Because you're here on the hierarchy of race and how we value human beings, and the people of India are here, or the people of Senegal are here, right? And so all of this emerges in that same period of time. And I'm doing my best at this a lot, right? So if it's too much, stop me. Like, let me know if you have a question or you need us to unpack something. Another very, very important aspect of this moment in this history and this emerging Atlantic world system, right? That begins, we can say roughly around 1500, right? Where, 1492 Columbus sails, you know, I want to go in a whole nother direction with that interesting history. You know, Columbus actually has a navigator or an interpreter on his ship who is of Spanish Jewish ancestry. Some of the Moors were actually Jewish. It's interesting. The story of the Moors is not just a story of African Muslims who take Spain. It's African Muslims who go to Spain answering a call of oppressed people saying, come help us get this tyrant off our neck. And one of the main groups they find that support them and collaborate with them are the Jews of Spain, right? And so they're also the people that are targeted in the Reconquista, you know, when the Moors are vilified and attacked in the way that they are, right? And they're forced to change their religion. But one of these people who was forced to change his religion maybe held on to it. Many of the people held on to their Islam or their Judaism in secret, right? One of these people was Columbus's interpreter. And the historical records indicate that when they got to Hispaniola, right, the way they were able to converse and figure out where they were is this interpreter spoke with some of the Taino people in Arabic. How they knew Arabic, Allahu Alam. And this is where you get the speculation where people say, well, they were Muslims, you know, in the Americas. Yes. Yes. So this is in the Caribbean and like Dominican Republic, I think, right? It's the same island. Dominican Republic and Haiti, right? This is what people call Hispaniola. And the Taino people are some of the indigenous people, right, to that part of the world, right? Clear? That a good short, mashallah, alhamdulillah. So many things that I'm truncating and not doing justice to, but I'm doing my best. May Allah help us. But one very important aspect of this emerging nationalism and this emerging unity among Western European nations that bring about this system is their hatred for Muslims and Islam. Why? Because for over 700, almost 800 years, you have the Muslim presence in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula, right? And this Muslim presence benefits Europe immensely. This is how someone mentioned the European Renaissance, right? Part of what sparks the Renaissance is the translation of ancient European, Greek and Roman wisdom, right? By Muslims into Arabic that then becomes now accessible to the rest of Europe, right? Sort of pulling Europe out of the Dark Ages. But still, there becomes a growing sentiment of anger and what's the word I'm looking for? Just anger and revulsion of this Muslim presence, right? In this Christian, supposedly or presumably or ostensibly or wannabe Christian area, right? In fact, one of the things that Judge Robin talks about in his book that I find is really interesting, he talks about how Portugal gets founded as a nation, right? And the way Portugal gets founded as a nation is you have these crusaders who are on the way to the Arab world to participate in the crusade in Jerusalem. But on the way, they stop in what is today Portugal. And they say, well, we got Muslims here on the Iberian Peninsula. Let's set up shop here, kick them out, and that becomes the foundation of Portugal. And he talks about Portugal as being a state, a kind of crusader nation, right? A crusader nation that's propped up by Italian and English, Italian and British business interests, right? So you have one nation that is giving sort of economic support to another nation for them to displace Muslims. That doesn't sound familiar at all, right? So I made that one over some people's heads. But we find the same thing happening today, right? If you keep up, if you're listening to this Trump so-called peace plan, right? Who's allowing that? Who's financing that, right? This has been going on ever since the 16th century. Right? Portugal, interestingly enough, is also the first country to come to West Africa and enslave people. They start by forcibly enslaving people. They take them to Portugal, right? This is the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Eventually, they realize that we don't just want slaves, we also want gold, and we want other resources. So they build relationships with certain groups of Africans that help them to find slaves. And they say this whole snatching people up stuff is hard work. right? We got to find another way. Somebody here is going to be willing to help us out, right? And so this is the actual beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. It's a crusade. It's a crusade. And part of the reason why West Africans are identified as people that it's okay to enslave is because they're seen as a part of this larger global community of what they sometimes call Saracens, what they sometimes call Moors, what they sometimes call Arab, and sometimes they just came out and said the Muslims, right? But once they begin to enslave people from sub-Saharan Africa, the narrative begins to shift. And now they have to find, now different justifications emerge for this system, right? So it goes from, well, you know, we can enslave them because they're the evil Muslims, to, well, we now have a good relationship with Morocco as a country, right? But we want to keep enslaving these West African people. So how do we do that when we have a treaty with Morocco that says we can't enslave Muslims under the reign of the Moroccan king, right? Well, so these West Africans, they're not really Muslim, or they're a different kind of Muslim, or they do some kind of syncretic play Muslim stuff, right? They don't really have a history, right? And whether they had a history or not, we giving them Christianity and we're civilizing them, so it's all good, right? So this is how you begin to see the old racial logic of all of those brown and black skinned Muslims are the enemy, to a new racial logic that sort of parses out different types of other, right? Different types of foreign people that it's okay for us to oppress in these ways. And then the last thing I'm going to say, and then we're going to transition to the next sort of segment of the presentation, inshallah, is the thing that emerges from this period. In the beginning, you have the transatlantic slave trade and you have colonization, you have all these things. Ultimately, what all of this allows for is what historians call the Industrial Revolution. Y'all know what that is, the Industrial Revolution? You heard this term? It's basically where suddenly you have these Western world powers, right? Western countries in Western Europe and what becomes North America, right? Where you have places where people are able to shift from an agrarian economy, where they're farming and they're sort of producing the things that their people want and producing things to sell, to actually large-scale industry, where you have factories that are building things, manufacturing things for export, and a system of wage labor, where we say, okay, you sell me your body from 9 to 5, or back then it was worse than that. Maybe it was 9 to 10 or something, right? But we're gonna sell you your body from 9 to 5, and we'll give you a paycheck for that, right? And you'll help us produce something that will enable us to make stuff that's so expensive that you yourself can't buy them, even though you helped to make it, right? This is one way of sort of describing this industrial revolution, right? And this industrial revolution is only made possible by slave labor. There's another book I should have put up here called Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. Excellent book, right? But part of his argument, and a lot of people have made this argument since then. There's a guy named Sven Beckert, I think is his name, who wrote a book called The Half Has Never Been Told. The half has never been told, but now it's become a popular subject. People don't give Eric Williams his props because he wrote this way back in the day, but it's become a popular subject where people talk about the fact that what enables France and Britain and all these other countries to industrialize is in large part the wealth gained from enslaved African labor, right? Again, 1/3 of whom at least were Muslim. So what is the beginning of Muslim story in this part of the world? This is it, right? It's providing the labor that allows for industrialization, right? And one way that you can kind of check this, one of the evidences that you can look at to sort of prove this or see if this proves out, if you look at every country that industrializes, right, their industrialization almost directly correlates with their abolition of slavery. So Britain industrializes. For centuries, or maybe not centuries, but for maybe at least a century, you have people in Britain that have enough of a conscience that they're saying we should abolish slavery. But the reigning business and governmental interests are saying, nah, we don't want to hear that. Once Britain industrializes and the slave system becomes essentially obsolete, they say, okay, yeah, now we're going to abolish slavery and we want nobody else to be able to benefit from slavery. France says, nah, we still got slaves. We still have Haiti, right? And then there's the Haitian Revolution, which was also sort of inspired in part by Muslims, right? Well, I don't know if you've discussed that with them yet, but some of the sort of architects of the Haitian Revolution or inspirational figures who incite the Haitian Revolution are enslaved African Muslims brought to Jamaica and brought to Haiti. Duddy Boukman, who they call Boukman because he was a man of the book, which some of the scholars say we think that's because he was a Hafiz, right? And Macandal, right? So France finally is able to industrialize, and they say, yes, abolish the slavery thing for everybody, right? And on and on and on until you get to the last two countries that are able to industrialize, also the last two to agree to the abolition of slavery. Spain and, ironically enough, Portugal. But yeah, mashallah. So that this is I wanted to start, and I know this is a lot, right? This is a lot, but I wanted to set the stage. We don't talk about this stuff in these kind of spaces enough, right? In these kind of spaces, in our religious spaces, one of my professors, she said something to me one time that always stuck with me. She said, Rasul, your job, they call me Rasul, so your job is to help your community understand how they've gotten into the predicament that they're in, right? What are the forces that put them where they are? And then what they should do to empower themselves in the face of that, right? So that's your job, right? So as a historian, I could just, tell you some interesting tidbits about history, right? Just meander through history and this interesting thing happened. And there's a place for that, right? I mean, I remember as a kid, I used to love Black History Month when I would hear about how Black people invented everything from the street light to the gas mask to the ironing board, right? But now, because I had a healthy diet of that as a young man, now I want more, right? I want to understand, okay, well, if Black people invented everything, then how come Black people seem like they got the worst of everything, right? What happened? And so similarly, my hope is that some of these comments can help us get to an understanding of what happened, right? Inshallah. Yes.
So it seems like the common denominator is that whether you were in Europe, Portugal, or wherever part of the world, they were always trying to conquer or colonize Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to go into why?
What
does Muslims have that
right
until this day from the 16th century? What do we do?
Yeah, I mean, all I can do is speculate. You may know the answer to that better than me.
Because it not only just do they do it in Portugal, we have like from where we're from, Khorasan areas.
Mm-hmm.
The Persian Gulf too, they try to colonize. But
For
we
sure.
don't allow them because we have to get up and make an army for them.
Sure.
Like hundreds of years ago. But like, what is the thing? You can't just hold it.
Well,
So
my attempt at an answer is three things. One, I don't think, and I was trying to avoid using this word, but I don't think capitalism discriminates, right? Because, you can look at people who practice African traditional religions, people who practice Zoroastrianism, who are also victimized by the same system, right? But, and this is point number two, Islam was at the center of a global system prior to the rise of this system that we're talking about, of the rise of the West. And Cedric Robinson calls it racial capitalism, right? And he calls it racial capitalism because he's arguing that you can't separate the two. You can't have capitalism without it being racialized, because the same system that spreads this economic order spreads this notion of a racial hierarchy. So they go hand in hand. And you don't have the rise of this system to prominence without enslaved labor, right? So this racial capitalist system doesn't discriminate, but its main sort of competition is the Muslims. Even if you start to look at the ways in which the economic order diverges, right? For a long time, many people, at least the Abrahamic faith traditions of the world, that people didn't really have an interest. Right? I don't really know about the Jewish tradition when it comes to that, but I know at least Islam and Christianity didn't deal in interest, right? Suddenly, during this time period, the Catholic Church says it's okay for you to deal in interest, right? Also, you find the emergence of the invention of the corporation. This is kind of tricky. Corporations are invented during this time. What do corporations do, right? Corporations allow you, so in Islam, what happens when you pass away if you're a wealthy person? You got a lot of money, what happens when you pass away? It gets distributed to your family, right? Corporations allow for something different to happen, where now suddenly the corporation can hold all the wealth. It's not my money, the corporation holds it. And it doesn't get redistributed back into the community. And so over the course of generations, the corporation amasses more and more and more wealth, which fuels more and more inequality. I'm not saying corporations are haram, right? I'm not saying that. You know, shuyukh, they say we have to deal according to the paradigm we live in to a point, right? So I'm not telling you can't start a corporation. But the invention of a corporation is, again, one of these ways in which this new economic system sort of goes in the opposite direction of the Islamic world system, right? And the Islamic world system is kind of a loose system, right? It's not really one system. It's a general framework that unites all of these different communities that have very different cultural contexts, right? But one way you can think about it is you have sort of unity without uniformity, right? Whereas this other system is like the Borg. You know what I mean? The Borg, you old enough to remember Star Trek? Like, you must assimilate. Resistance is futile. You know, you got to take on all of this, right? And you see it. You see it with like sort of Western imperialism, how it's like you have to take on all of these different aspects of what we think of as democracy, what we think of as capitalism and whatnot. But yeah, so that's my attempt to answer that very good question. Well, okay, I wanna sort of jump now, and I'm not going to talk today because we're already running very low on time. So this next section I'm gonna try to keep concealed to maybe like 5 to 7 minutes. Can we do that? Inshallah, I'm gonna try. Is that doable? Okay, I'm skipping over the story of those enslaved African Muslims, right? How they worship, how they lived, how they struggled to hold on to their Islamic identity as enslaved people. That's a whole nother presentation. And I decided not to do that because that's something I know other people can do, including Sheikh Mendes. He has maybe, I think, more expertise in that even than me. So I wanted to focus on what I could offer that, inshallah, I felt that was fulfilling a need, right? But that's a history that I think you're going to learn something about on the 22nd, inshallah ta'ala. But what I will say is you have these stories of enslaved African Muslims. We know them. We know some of their names. We know that many of them were at the heart of slave rebellions, right? Movements to fight against the pervading slave system in Brazil, in Haiti, in South Carolina, in all of these places, right? But by the late 19th century, late 1800s, right? So we're talking about the period that includes the abolition of slavery, right? The abolition in name, you still had different forms of slavery. And even a little bit after that, right? By the time you get to the later part of the 1800s, it appears that the destructive nature of the slave system in the Americas, or at least in North America, really succeeds in preventing Muslim people from sort of maintaining their religious identity and practice and passing it on to the next generation. And that's not an absolute. You have some exceptions to that. You have like these islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia where people are able to hold on to some degree of Islamic identity and practice. But for the most part, you don't have now 1/3 of the enslaved populations and their descendants being Muslim. You have maybe a smattering here or there, one-off folks, right? Not communities. But something happens in the early 20th century, 1910, 1920, you start to begin to see people of African descent now reconnecting with Islam in various different ways, right? In various different ways. I believe you had a lecture that I heard was excellent that discussed sort of the history of the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam and the Ahmadiyya movement. And that story is important. That story is fascinating, right? My research focuses primarily on the history of African American Orthodox Muslims. I say Orthodox because prior to 1979, people aren't, in the American context, they're not really having fights over if you're Sunni or Shia, right? So to say Sunni would be a little misleading because there may have been a few of these folks who were Shia, right? There were a few of these folks who were Shia, not many, but some. But the way people identified themselves as Muslims was not, are you Sunni or Shia? It was, are you Orthodox or are you not? You know, are you somebody who feels that you need to pray 5 times a day, right? Or are you somebody, and this isn't, and I'm not vilifying any of the other groups, but, or are you a community that says, well, that's not what we see as being fundamental to an Islamic identity, right? And so my research is focused on Orthodox Muslims. And so I wanted to kind of tell, in these last 5 minutes, a little bit of that story through images, right? This is an image of Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija. Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal and Mother Khadija Faisal. They were the founders of the oldest African-American led Muslim congregation. They started in Harlem. I say oldest, not first, because there are other communities that started around the same time, but they're the only one who built an institution that still exists, right? So they started in Harlem, 1920s, late 1920s, ultimately went to Brooklyn, established a masjid that's still there today. Now it's called Masjid Dawood. They called it the Islamic Mission of America. People used to call it State Street because it was located on 143 State Street. Very important for you to know these two people, this husband and wife duo, right? They built the community together. You know, it wasn't just Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija was in the background. She did much of the work to establish the community and to keep the community running. Don't have nearly enough time to talk about them like I want to, but I want to point out one very interesting aspect of their community is that they built a community that attracted not only African, they were actually Afro-Caribbean immigrants, but not only African-American and Afro-Caribbean Muslims, but also Arab Muslims, East African Muslims from Sudan and Somalia, South Asian Muslims from Pakistan, and well, what is today Pakistan and Bangladesh, right? But this is before the partition, right? And the community of Muslims in urban centers like New York and Detroit, my research focuses on New York, right? Looked very interesting. These were ethnically diverse Muslim communities, right? That were usually founded by Black American Muslims, right? Who felt that it was important to build communities that were welcoming to all the Muslims. And the communities of South Asian, Arab, and East African Muslims that came during that time had no choice but to live in Black neighborhoods. They couldn't live in the white neighborhood. They couldn't live in what is today like the white suburb, right? They had to live next door to the Black community, right? And so, and they tended to be working class people. Many of them were men who worked on British ships, who then would jump ship and then they would sort of become integrated into these African-American communities. So there was intermarriage, there was a shared interest, they were building their worship spaces together, and they had a shared economic interest too, because they came from like a similar kind of class background. Different than the immigrant Muslim communities that emerged after 1965, when you have a change in immigration law that allows larger numbers of people from majority Muslim countries to come and recruits people who have professional backgrounds, right? People who can come to be doctors and engineers and things like that, right? And I say that simply so you can begin to understand why there's the kind of gaps in separation in our Muslim community that exists today. They didn't always exist, right? They didn't always exist, right? And part of what I want to sort of push you all to think about is how do we get back to that moment? It's easy for us to all work together when we have to. We have to live next to each other. Can none of us get a job, right? But it's harder for us to do that when we don't have those same material sort of pressures to work together, right? But this is still what Islam calls on us to do, right? This is still what Islam calls on us to do, to divest from the kind of stratification and valuation or devaluing of humanity, right? That this Western world system, we call it racial capitalism just for the sake of the conversation, right? Maybe we can call it the Dajjalic system, right? People say the Dajjal is the TV, maybe, or maybe it's capitalism. But this is what the community looked like at that time. And now what I want to transition, I have to skip over some of this, but another thing that's really interesting about Sheikh Dawood's community is he actually, he actually, through his work, I'll go back just to do this quickly. This is nice. So you see this green dot. This is the location of the masjid that they founded. And this blue dot is the Brooklyn Bridge Piers. So when Muslim men from South Asia, Yemen, the Arab world, East Africa, who worked on British ships would dock here, and they would get off the ship and they would walk down the street, they would inevitably walk by the masjid. At first, it wasn't a masjid. It was just Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija's brownstone, right? And there's a story of one Yemeni man who walks by and he says, he sees Sheikh Dawood. Maybe Sheikh Dawood is dressed to where he can recognize he's a Muslim. Assalamu alaikum. This is my son, y'all. Say assalamu alaikum. What, you want to sit with me? Okay, come on. So now I got to speed it up. I wonder if somebody sent him, go get your daddy. Hurry up, he's talking too much. But when people are walking down the street, this one Yemeni man, he walks down the street, he sees this Muslim man, this black Muslim man, he says, where can I pray? He says, come pray in my home. He goes and sends word through this global network of seafaring workers, merchant seamen, that when you come to Brooklyn, when you come to New York, there's this black man who lets you pray in his house, right? And so he established the house as a masjid. And ultimately, Sheikh Dawood, and actually there's some little bit of time discrepancy, but at some point, because it probably would have had to happen before this, but at some point he even gets an ijazah from the renowned Algerian Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi, rahmatullah alayhi, who, if you know something about the history of Islam in France, he, I believe, does the first inaugural salat at the Grand Masjid in Paris. If you go to Paris, have a big, beautiful masjid. He's the first one who led that salat, right? So this big, renowned Algerian scholar, he sends Sheikh Dawood an ijazah. And one man I interviewed, he said he was sitting in the office with Sheikh Dawood, and Sheikh Dawood said, people always ask me, Sheikh this, Sheikh that, Sheikh of what? What make you a Sheikh? What give you this permission? And he took off his turban, and he took off his kufi, and inside he had a leather pouch, and he said, this is my permission. And it's an ijazah from Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi. So I had to tell you that story. But I wanted to, and this is going to be the last section, I promise, talk to you a little bit about some of the shifts that happened in the 1960s and 70s, right? Where you have a number of things happening in these, well, at least in urban spaces, right? Where the Muslim communities that reside there are sort of shifting their focus, and they're really beginning to focus on building, on achieving some degree of self-determination, of independence. They're trying to build a political economic infrastructure. What do I mean by that? Businesses, schools, right? Their own newspapers, right? Which would have been like the main media of the day, right? How can they be independent? How can they divest from this wider economic system, right? That relegates certain people to the bottom and certain people to the top. Muslims have been for a long time, going back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the way we opt out is we just bounce, right? We make hijrah. Hijrah look a lot of different ways, right? During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was one Sahaba that was in Medina, and because of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, I say this in a lot of my talks, because of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, he had to leave and go back to Mecca, right? And on the way to Mecca, he escaped and set up his own little maroon colony, really. And maroons is the name for people in the American context, the enslaved African who ran away. We have a good friend, Brother Suleiman Yassin, Habib Yassin Coffee down in Atlanta. He always said, we have in the African American community, we have the narrative of the house slave and the field slave. But they don't tell us about the third one who said, I'm not a house slave or a field slave, I'm gonna run away, right? And do my own thing off the plantation. You had thousands of enslaved Africans who ran away and did that, right? And you had a Sahaba who did it. And then other Sahaba who were faced with the same reality joined him. And then they began to raid the Meccan caravans until the Meccans finally said to Rasul, take them back. They've given us too many problems, right? So you have the same phenomenon among these now sizable communities of Muslims, African-American Muslims that emerge in urban spaces in the 1960s and 70s. They're trying to address a host of problems, increased urbanization. Their communities are becoming harder and harder to live in. They have fewer and fewer, less and less access to jobs, right? It's engines of economic uplift. And so in New York City, the two most important communities, largest, most influential communities that emerge at this time are Yasin Mosque in Brooklyn, which is the headquarters of the Darul Islam movement, which becomes the largest national network, or the largest network of African-American mosques in the country. And the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood in Harlem, right? And the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood focuses on building a strong community locally in Harlem that can benefit the surrounding neighborhood, right? And both of these communities do amazing work that transforms the community, that endears them to the community, such that when these communities are targeted by the police, by the state, right, or by criminals, right, people in the community, everyday people who are not Muslim, come to the defense of these communities, right? For time's sake, maybe if we have time, question and answer, I can give some specific examples, but I'm just going to say, generally speaking, you had incidents where people would attack these communities and non-Muslims would come and protect the Muslims, right? And this is also true of the Nation of Islam. One of the things that's important about this period is that many of these communities, like these two I mentioned, they're decidedly Orthodox Muslims. They're dedicated to the Sunnah, but they're able to recognize that there's a lot of value in what the nation is doing with regard to building these political, economic infrastructures to give them independence, to benefit the community. So they say, we'll take that, right? Imam Talib Abdul Rashid, who's pictured right here, the current Imam of the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, he told me one time that his teacher, Sheikh Tawfiq, the founder of the masjid, told him, he said, when it comes to theology, belief, practice of your deen, stick with Quran and Sunnah. But when it comes to the situation, the material, economic, political situation of the black man in America, you can listen to everything Elijah Muhammad say, right? And so there wasn't this dissonance that, well, if I'm on the Sunnah, then I can't be concerned about the issues that face my community specifically, right? It wasn't this kind of dissonance, right? Generally speaking, right? And it was a conversation, right? The Muslims had conversations about, well, what role should a sort of emphasis on helping our particular community of people play, as we build our communities. So the last thing I'm going to do, the Darul Islam movement, I believe, really among the African Americans, any Sunni masajid, right, during this era, builds the most robust political economic infrastructure, right? And I'm going to sort of tell you about that through pictures, right? So this is a picture of some brothers from the Darul Islam movement who are selling incense and oils. This became a major source of employment for members of the Darul Islam movement, and it allowed the men in the movement to continue. I'm looking for a sister's name. That's why I'm typing. The sister who created this site. But it became a way in which the men in the movement were able to attend the 5 Salah, right? They didn't have to work a 9 to 5, right? You would make your money selling your incense and oils, and it became a way that you can provide jobs for people, right? Whether they're formerly incarcerated people, regardless of what your educational background is, right? Regardless of what your life, whether it's high or low, right? This is something you can do to feed your family, right? And this is a picture here of Shirley Chisholm, first African-American woman to run for president, right? Hanging out in Brooklyn, talking to the brothers from the Darul Islam movement. Yeah. Oh, and I should say, so they start the first incense making factory in America, right? It's the Darul Islam movement. They manufacture their own incense and oils, right? This is a picture of some of the brothers and sisters coming from prison. The Darul Islam movement created a really strong and robust prison outreach program, right? That introduced scores of people to Islam in prison. One famous example is a brother named H. Rap Brown, who was the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and a member of the Black Panther Party, who becomes Muslim after being incarcerated for his activism, meets members of the Darul Islam movement in prison. They give him dawah. He becomes Muslim. He becomes Imam Jamil Alameen, one of our most prominent leaders, imams in America. And he's currently, now I don't have time to get into the details, he's currently incarcerated for a crime that the evidence suggests he did not do. And so we pray that Allah liberate him and free him. This is a picture of the independent school, Madrasa Shahadatain, named after two brothers in the community who were killed, unfortunately, in an altercation. but some of the sisters in the community started a daycare that ultimately evolved into a full-on independent school. This is Ra'ad. This is some of the men in the Dar al-Islam movement who participated in something called Ra'ad. It's an Arabic word that means thunder. This was the sort of community security force that the Dar al-Islam created. If you know anything about the history of the Nation of Islam, you've probably read about the FOI, the Fruit of Islam, right? So Dar al-Islam creates their own group, their own force to make sure that not only the Muslims are safe, but that the neighborhood around the Muslims, right, is safe and secure, right? And this goes back to, again, who has the right to secure your neighborhood? Is it the state? Is it the police force? Maybe the people in the police force don't live in your neighborhood, don't know your name, don't look like you, or is it people from your community, right? This is a picture of the printing press when it arrived in Brooklyn that the Dar al-Islam movement used to produce their newspaper, Jihad al-Akbar. These are some pages from one of the issues of Jihad al-Akbar. It's beautifully done magazine. It got some funding from the Muslim World League as well. And this is a picture of the Mosque Islam Brotherhood. And the Dar al-Islam movement unfortunately split apart during the 1980s, but the Mosque Islam Brotherhood is still going strong. I showed a picture of Imam Talib earlier, still active. This is a picture of Sheikh Tawfiq, the founder of the Mosque Islam Brotherhood. And I should mention, Sheikh Tawfiq was himself a follower of Malcolm X. When Malcolm X leaves the nation, Sheikh Tawfiq, who's already a Sunni Muslim, goes to Malcolm and says, yeah, I'm with you. I was waiting for this. Yes. Please. Please, please.
I'm glad that you mentioned Mosque Islam Brotherhood. I, for one, took my Shahada in 1972 at the Mosque Islam Brotherhood at the Black Seas on 127th Street in Harlem. This is where I met the late Sheikh Allama Tawfiq, was reciting Arabic right down in the Black Seas on 127th Street. I took my Shahada there. I didn't know who this brother was during the recitation that was so magnificently beautiful. He gave me my name, Hasib Abdul Rahman, gave me the meaning, told me exactly what the meaning would be, and explained to me, as he explained to many others during that time who took their Shahada, that their name would have great significance and that we should forever strive to live up to it. Also, during that period of time, 1972, at the height of, there was the Western Sunrise, the local paper established by the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood. The publisher, the lead publisher, was the late Sheikh Allama Tawfiq. We also had at that time the Banner Halal Tea Room on 145th Street, the St. Nicholas Avenue. We had a restaurant. This is all going on during that period of the early 70s on down to the mid 80s. And then also we had at that time
there was a school as well.
Restaurant.
There was a school as well, right?
Excuse me.
I think it was a school.
The school was started in 1974. They were waiting for me. I was teaching at that time over to the Trenton Public School District. They said, as soon as you leave, we're going to start that school. I left Trenton Public School District in 1974. The principals there had begged me to say, because they needed and they were recruiting African American men to come in and teach these young people in the Trenton Public School System. So I left. As soon as I left, 1974, we established the Banner Halal Islamic Academy. Right now today, the Muslims celebrate 2 years in New York City. That was Sheikh Allama Tawfiq's first dream to get that approved. He didn't live it out because he passed away in 1988. Imam Talib comes aboard in 1988. He becomes the Imam. I think the holiday, both heads, were established somewhere between 1990 and 1992. So the Muslims all over the world, when the Eid's in New York City, when you hear it, they don't announce it as the Eid. They just say a holiday. This is what they say. So I just want to add a few things to what you were saying about the history, but at the same time, I'm very happy to see that you collaborated to 2 masjids because y'all seen, as the Sheikh was saying, was very powerful at that time, and those were the two leading as you so accurately portrayed. So I just wanted to add that to it.
And the only thing I will correct you on is I'm not the Sheikh. But thank you so much. Allah reward you. And you said a lot of what I was going to say, right? Which is great because now the Sheikh can't be mad at you. You can be mad at me for time. But absolutely, one thing I'll add is that Sheikh Tawfiq rahmatullahi alayhi, he is a Muslim who already has some knowledge of Arabic. He comes, spends some time with Malcolm. Malcolm sends him to Egypt to study in Egypt. He spends about 4 years in Egypt. While he's in Egypt, Malcolm X rahmatullahi is assassinated, is martyred. And he tells some of his followers, when Sheikh Tawfiq comes back, protect him. He indicates to them, this is somebody that I'm grooming for leadership. So he comes back. The Muslim Mosque Inc. at this point has essentially ceased to exist, but it sort of reformulates around Sheikh Tawfiq and becomes the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, right? Yeah, I'm stopping myself from saying more. But again, the big takeaway is both of these communities were successful in building these political economic infrastructures that allowed them to have some independence. So for a number of reasons, these communities, like the ones I mentioned, have been unable to do some of the same work now. And there's a lot of reasons for that we don't have that much time to get into. I'll say one thing: the middle class is shrinking, right? The capability for working class people to come and put their pennies together to start a school or start a successful business, it's much harder now than it was, right? Also, you have different systems in major cities around the country designed to make sure certain corporations are successful and thrive, and often displace other communities. So you have things like gentrification. You have all of these different mechanisms that make it very difficult to do these kinds of things on the same scale that the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood and the Dar al-Islam movement were able to do them in the 60s and the 70s and even into the 80s. But, because I always like to end on a positive note, you still have communities that are doing aspects of it today, right? That are finding ways. You can't necessarily have your Ra'ad or your MIB security team or your FOI in the street, policing the neighborhood in the same way. We got our radical Muslim defense force. And if you come in here trying to mess with us, even if you're the police, we're going to protect the Muslims, right? It's a different political moment, right? But there are other things that communities are still doing. This is a picture from the African American Islamic Institute, a Quran school in Medina Bay, in Senegal. This is the place that me and my family lived for a year in Medina Bay. It is a central hub of Islamic learning, in particular of the subject of tazkiyah, of spiritual purification, right, in Senegal, West Africa. Sheikh Hassan Sisi, rahmatullahi alayhi, right, who passed away in 2008, I believe, 2009, right? So thank you. Sheikh Hassan Sisi rahmatullahi establishes relationships with African American Muslims, first in New York, including Imam Saeed Abdul Salam, right? Sheikh Tawfiq's Naib, right? One of the co-founders of the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood. He meets Sheikh Hassan and begins to learn from Sheikh Hassan and becomes one of the pioneers of this community, right? I always like to mention men and women, so I'll mention there's many men and women who helped to build this community, but there's a woman named Sister Kareem Abdul Kareem, right? Who's one of the first people to take tariqah, right? Maybe the first or second person to become a part of this community, who dedicated herself to helping to build this school in Senegal for African-American Muslim children from any kind of background, right? You could be Sunni, you could be Shia. If your parents wanted you to learn Quran, Sheikh Hassan, the school that Sheikh Hassan and Sister Kareem and these people built together would accept you, right? And so now you've had hundreds of African-American Muslim children who've been educated at this school. It's turned out more African-American Hufaz of Quran than any other institution in the world that I know of, right? I could talk all day about just this community and just this effort, but I know we don't have a lot of time. But these are African-American children wearing the traditional attire that Muslims in West Africa wear, right? And some, Western attire too. You see, they're mixing it up. But this is one of the efforts that were created in order to enable African-American Muslims and any Muslim really who wanted to have an alternative to the New York City or to the public school, right? So this is not just New York. This is children from New York, from Detroit, Atlanta, DC, all of these places, right? This is a picture of a place called Islamburg, New York, in upstate New York. So when the Dar al-Islam movement essentially breaks up, you have one contingent of the community that creates a new community, right? That called the Muslims of America is their official name. And they focus on building rural enclaves, right? Around the country. They're in something like 36 cities, I think. 36, not cities, but 36 towns, where they've developed these rural enclaves where the Muslims can live sort of off the grid, right? This is one in upstate New York. And it got some media attention because in like 6 years, there were like 3 different attempts by white supremacist extremists to try to like attack this community, right? And destroy this community and commit violence against people and kill people in this community, right? But alhamdulillah, the communities are still thriving. And this, I think, is my last slide, or second to last slide. These are images from some Muslims who are today attempting to intervene in urban communities to deal with the problem of violence, right? So this is Sheikh Mujahid. This is a sheikh from LA who was instrumental in negotiating the truce between the Bloods and the Crips, right? Historic truce between the Bloods and the Crips. This is Minister Carlos Muhammad. Minister Carlos Muhammad of the Nation of Islam in Baltimore, who similarly negotiated a truce between the Bloods and the Crips in Baltimore, right? During the Black Lives Matter protests, right? The Bloods and the Crips got together and said, we got other people trying to attack us. We're not going to attack one another, right? And they were brought together by this Muslim brother from the Nation of Islam. And what's interesting is the media found out about it and reported it as Muslims and Bloods and Crips are coming together. And so we should be worried now about whether or not they're going to attack police, right? It was a lot more succinct than that, but that was essentially a headline for one news story, right? But I show this to show that there are still Muslims who are engaged in this kind of work. And we have to begin to think about the ways that we can continue it. And I like this as my last slide because, yes, sir?
I put myself next to
You want to sit?
Ma.
You want to sit next to Ma?
No, I put yourself next to
You put my
Ma.
stuff next to Ma. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. The last thing I'll say, because I like to end with some takeaways, right? Like, what does all this mean? What is the point, right? So the big things that I want you to take away, right? Really, I'll narrow it down to 2 things so they're digestible, right? The first is that now that we have some understanding of how we got to where we are, right? Part of the answer, part of what's necessary is for us to be able to divest from some of these racial and economic logics that pervade today, right? We have to separate from them, at the very least psychologically, right? And it's not enough to just say, well, we're going to treat everybody good and try to not discriminate. No. When we see somebody who has less than us, what do we think about that? Do we think that it's because there's some kind of moral failing? Or do we think that it's because they're not smart enough, or because they didn't play the game right? Or do we understand that your rizq is the qadr of Allah, right? And that there are systems in place to set up stratification in a certain kind of way, right? I was in Qatar maybe a couple months ago in Doha, and it was ajib, it was interesting, man, because I saw this place where there was a social stratification that looked nothing like the social stratification in America. I saw a man that was darker than Imam, with hair like mine, who had on an aqal, and he was an indigenous Qatari, and he had all the rights that a Qatari had, right? He's balling, right? And then I saw African-American folks who loved it because they were saying we get treated so much better here than we get treated in America, right? And then I saw South Asian folks who were being treated the way Mexican workers, Latino, Latinx workers often get treated, right? In the southern part of America, right? And it was just different. And I didn't go into that situation and say, well, all these Desi folks must have just did something wrong, right? So when you see the kinds of social stratification that exist in our communities, in our society, how do you interpret that? How do you address it, right? one thing I say just very clearly, I just make it plain, like Malcolm used to say, right? In this country, the two largest ethnic groups, according to every study done before 2011, all the studies said that the two largest ethnic groups of Muslims in America were African American and South Asian, right? And me and Imam Mendes have talked about this. Many Imams have expressed to me. I've even heard Imam Talib talk about the sort of divide between the inner city masajid and the urban masajid, right? I had a conversation with Sheikh Anwar Muhammad, Imam Anwar Muhammad. What did I say? Suburban. Yeah, thank you for the correction. And he said something I thought was very profound. He said, what people in our communities don't recognize is that these two groups, inner city folks and suburban folks, actually need each other, right? Because there's a lot of different things that it's going to take for us to change our condition in this part of the world, right? It's going to take resources. It's going to take cultural capital. It's going to take having a history in this country where you can't be told to go back anywhere, right? It's going to take a certain kind of know-how that enables you to understand how you can continue to be Muslim, right? And not sort of lose yourself when you're bombarded with all of the dunya that we get bombarded with in this country, right? I went to undergrad at Duke University. I met so many Muslims from different parts of the world who just kind of came and lost their mind, right? And they would look at me and they say, Rasul, how you here in college, your parents ain't here, you're not drinking, you're not doing the things we do. Why not? And I'm thinking, well, why? Because I already saw that and decided I didn't want that, right? So that's the first point. And then the second thing, and the last sort of takeaway that I want you to take away from this. Well, you know what? I want to make it digestible, right? So we're going to focus on that, right? We have to think about unity and how we can not only sort of psychologically divest from that, but also materially divest to be able to create institutions that give us some level of autonomy and that give us the ability to actually benefit the community around us, right? Imam Mendes, you probably know about the Oasis School in Cleveland, right? I don't think it exists anymore, but I remember reading about the school and it was so profound because it was a Muslim school. Imam Dawood. It was a Muslim school, but it wasn't just Muslims who went to the school. Because the goal of the school wasn't just to give children a place to go where they wouldn't be around non-Muslim children, right? Or African-American or Latino children, right? The goal was actually to create an educational alternative to the public school system that everybody could benefit from, right? So this is how we have to be thinking in terms of the kinds of institutions and whatnot we build. So I'm going to close out there. I know it was long-winded. Oh, you want to explain this? So the reason I like to end on this slide is because these are two of the most persistent markers of the Muslim presence and contribution to urban communities around the country, right? The bean pie and the incense and the oils, right? And they symbolize these two very important, robust projects to build these political economic alternatives, right? The nation, who build a nation off bean pies, right? Selling bean pies in newspapers. And the bean pie wasn't just, everybody know about the history of the bean pie? A little bit, right? Little bit. So the bean pie was created as a healthy alternative to other desserts, right? To other sweets. So it's made from navy beans, which makes it healthier than like a sweet potato pie, pecan pie. Yeah.
You have to explain, it doesn't taste like food mudammas.
I had food mudammas this morning. It doesn't taste like food mudammas. It's sweet. It's better. It's, mashallah, I should have brought some, man. It's my favorite dessert. Right, like a sweet potato pie, but better. Yeah.
So which region in the U.S. has the best bean pie?
My house that my wife made. And I'm not saying it just because she's my wife. I actually think even when I make it, it's nice. Mashallah. Between Philly and New York all day. New York all day. And I'm sorry, I know my Philly family might be mad. I'll say this, Philly has the most consistent bean pie. That Ali bean pie, you know, you're gonna get it anywhere you at in Philly, and it's gonna be you're gonna be satisfied. You're gonna be happy, right? My favorite bean pie is actually Newark, New Jersey. There's two. There's Grandma's and there's Pure Love. Pure Love, yeah. But I had one bean pie that I thought was even better than Pure Love, and dare I say, even better than the bean pie we make in my house. And that was a bean pie I had from St. Louis at the Justice or Else March in DC. there were people selling bean pies, and I brought a bean pie. And I looked at the wrapper, it said St. Louis. Okay, I think it was the best bean pie I've ever had in my life. I have no idea what community it was from. It's a legendary bean pie, right? I'm gonna be chasing that for the rest of my life. And then really quickly, on the other side, you have, hopefully it's self-explanatory, the incense and oils. This undertaking that the Dar Islam movement really popularized in urban spaces around the country, you still see it, right? You still see street vendors who use this as a way to be able to find gainful employment, where they're selling things like incense and oils and personal care products. In fact, if you go to black bookstores now, black bookstores used to be very robust in every major city. Now they're shrinking, they're closing. The few black bookstores that still exist, one of the things that allows them to subsist is selling, in addition to books, things like soap, things like incense, things like oils, things like shea butter, because those are things that you need. And this is the way that our communities were thinking. What can we sell that we know people are going to need, right? In Atlanta, I forget the brother's name, but man, it's fine. I should have wrote it down. I didn't think that I would mention it today. But you have Muslims who sell things like toilet paper and detergent. They say this stuff our people need, right? Abdul Malik Sharif. Nah. We Buy Black. WeBuyBlack.com, right? Yeah. So I'm going to end there. But I just wanted to put that period on it. And I'll do this so you can still see this beautiful image. And inshallah, we have some time for some questions. And I want to thank you all for being patient with me.
Takbir.
Allahu Akbar.
Takbir.
Allahu Akbar.
Takbir.
Allahu Akbar.
We want to thank Dr. Rasul Miller for an incredible, very profound, very deep lecture and presentation.
Very long.
And we want to thank all of you for staying. A few quick announcements, and then we'll open up for some Q&A. Imam Qarib Bashir is here. He wants you all to know that at the Islamic Center of Viewing, which is just about 30 minutes from here, there will be a lecture February 23rd at 1 p.m. by Imam Talib Abdul Rashid. You saw his picture here a few minutes ago. The head Imam of the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood on the African companions of Prophet Muhammad. Again, that will be February 23rd. And we also want you to know that on February 21st, I'm planning to take a group of Muslims from Central New Jersey to the Shabazz Center. Anyone know why the Shabazz Center is significant? That's where Malcolm X was martyred. That's where he was martyred in 1965. And there's going to be activities all day February 21st, but we're going to catch the tail end. If you're interested in that, let me know. I've already got some people that have come up to me. We'll be probably taking the train there, inshallah ta'ala. And then on February 22nd, we're going to be screening a UPF film, Prince Among Slaves, about Abdurrahman ibn Ibrahim Sori, who is one of the enslaved African Muslims that Rasul spoke about. I mentioned him during my khutbah earlier today. He freed himself. He managed to get free by writing Al-Fatiha, saying that it was the Lord's Prayer. It's an amazing 1-hour documentary. We'll be watching the entire movie, inshallah ta'ala, and then having Q&A discussion afterwards. And without any further ado, I'm sure many people have questions, comments. I ask that you keep your comments or questions to 1 minute so that we allow everyone who has a question or a comment to make it. I will keep the time. And is there anyone who can help us with the microphone? Anyone? Brother Tariq? Okay. Any questions, any comments?
Yep, please raise your hands.
I think we have one over here. Yeah. Oh.
Thank you.
Alhamdulillah.
Okay, assalamualaikum. This will be less than a minute. I just want to say, in terms of a little bit of trivia, Imam W.D. Muhammad and Sheikh Hassan Sisi died a few months apart.
That's right.
And both of them were
1 month apart.
amazing leaders. Another thing that I wanted to share, Imam Jamil El-Amin is extremely ill now, and he is legally blind. He incarcerated, as you know, in Colorado. Last thing, I want to at least promote my calendar. It's not my calendar, actually. I do a television show, one of the only interfaith television shows that's hosted by an African-American Muslim woman, me, 15 years. I have these calendars for $25 to help promote my television show. And the calendar was done by an African-American Muslim woman out of Detroit.
Thank you.
So I'm Zarina Shakir. Please buy these calendars. I only have 8 of them, $25. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
And they're beautiful.
That's good. They're very beautiful calendars. And I want to add, Sister Zarina, to what you said. Imam Wahid Muhammad Rahmatullah alayhi and Sheikh Hassan Sisi not only died the same year, but their teachers also died the same year. Sheikh Ibrahim Ilyas died in 1975. Imam Wahid Muhammad's father, Elijah Muhammad, passed away in 1975 as well. So that's only Allah can do that, right? Yes.
What is that?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I just have a clarification for the first segment of your
Sure. Please.
I've read of the slaves that were brought to the West, North America and South America. Approximately 85% of them died on the way and were buried at sea.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Because that would be a unique, even in the history of slavery of mankind, that would be a unique common and oppressive treatment.
Bismillah. You start that. So, it's a very good question.
Put it in.
Okay, I'll put it in. Sorry. Thank you, Mom. Yes, you do. He does too. But now, it's a good question. When it comes to numbers, assigning numbers to the transatlantic slave trade, it's very difficult. Very, very difficult. There are a couple of scholars. Joseph Inikouri is one. Walter Rodney, excellent scholar, wrote a great book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He's another that have tried to assign numbers to the transatlantic slave trade. Very difficult.
And he was asking, he heard that 85%
Right.
died in the Mafa.
Right. And determining how many died is difficult. It's certainly very conceivable, very believable that the majority of those taken from the African continent died in the transatlantic in the Middle Passage, in the Mafa. But it's very difficult to assign any real numbers. So these numbers are always shifting, right? And they're politicized. They're very politicized. There's some scholars who want to keep the count down to 6, and there's some scholars that say no, it begins at 60, right? So I wouldn't feel comfortable beginning to attest to or challenge a specific percent, but that number is not it's not outrageous, it's not unbelievable because of just how deadly and devastating the Middle Passage was. But was it 85%? I don't know. Right. It's a long way to say I don't know. But